Hola, hoy en Voces tenemos un invitado muy especial, Sanjay Rawal, director de cine y documental. Bienvenido, Sanjay.
Bienvenidos, gracias. Thank you for having me.
Gracias, Sanjay. ¿Por qué?
I got into filmmaking in a very unusual manner. I was on the path for scientific and technical success at university, but as soon as I finished my bachelor's in California, I moved to New York City to study with an Indian spiritual teacher named Sri Chinmoy. And that practice has guided a lot of my outer life. And I don't really consider myself a filmmaker. I don't try to identify myself through professional words. In a sense, I'm just a spiritual seeker. And where that takes me, hopefully, is a place where I can be of service to other people.
Estás trayendo a la pantalla grande temas y aspectos que el espectador no necesariamente quiere ver.
I spent my 20s traveling around the world with Sri Chinmoy. And I traveled to countries that I would have never chosen. I didn't know the first thing about places like East Timor, Cambodia, Vietnam. And even though we were based in New York City, 3 or 4 months of the year was spent abroad. And so it gave me a real sense of how limited our access is in the United States, in North America, in westernized society, to other narratives. And that got me into the world of human rights. I worked in human rights for about 10 years and gradually began to understand that the most satisfying projects I was working on were ones where I told other people's stories. There was a partnership between my eyes and my brain and a reality that was on the ground. And I was trying to find ways to shape those realities in order to help those communities get what they needed. In those days, it was political rights, it was human rights, it was philanthropic dollars. But when I learned that about myself, I began pushing more directly into storytelling.
¿Para qué?
A lot of my intention isn't really describable in words. But when it comes to filmmaking, I realized quickly after making a few short documentaries, that if I had an idea that I knew would capture my attention for the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years that's needed to make a film and then get it out there, that's what I wanted to do. And those ideas, they don't come every day, but I knew from my own background that when an idea like that comes, it's meant for you. Take it, try to be as humble as you can, and try to be an instrument. And so the first film was called Food Chains, and it was based on the story of a small group of trabajadores, of farm workers in Florida, in a city called Immokalee. And they were predominantly Oaxacan, Chiapan, and Guatemalan migrants. They were picking in terrible conditions, but they understood that the problem wasn't the farmers they were working for. It was for the gigantic companies like Walmart, McDonald's that were buying the tomatoes. These workers were brilliant, but they brought with them this indigenous sensibility, this community sense. When I went to visit them the first time, I felt, when I entered into their headquarters in Florida, a small, modest building, I felt that I was in a temple for truth. And soon enough, we were lucky to get people like Eva Longoria to be producers, Forrest Whitaker to be narrators. Shortly after that movie came out, I had the kind of just spark to do a film about a running race that is held near to my house. Completely different topic, than the farm worker film. But that film, 3100 Run and Become, to make the main storyline, which is about the world's longest race, 5,000 kilometers, 3,100 miles, to make that understandable, I went to very closed indigenous and traditional communities around the world. Southwestern ones like the Navajo Nation, ancient ones like the Kalahari Bushmen in Botswana, secretive ones like the monks of Mount Hiei in Japan, and showcased their stories to try to explain this phenomenon of this race. But it was similar, where the relationships I built with these other communities were very much based on intuition on both sides. They were both based on a spiritual recognition that although we might not understand where the project would go, that going on that journey together would be spiritually beneficial to both parties.
He tenido el privilegio, la fortuna de ver tus películas y sacuden tremendamente y a la vez arrojan las grandes preguntas: ¿de dónde venimos? ¿Quiénes somos? ¿A dónde vamos?
Wow, that's very, very kind of you to frame it that way. I'm just trying to inspire myself through these projects. And I feel that if my own spiritual life is healthy, if my own ability to silence my mind, to feel my heart, to feel love and peace and joy in my life, if that's strong, I can be better at recognizing those realities around me. And so, even though my films are very much about characters and their stories, what I try to focus on in the edit is bringing out scenes of their spiritual struggle and of their acceptance of victory or defeat. I won't give away the endings, but all of my movies are about 3-act journeys, but they don't always end in victory. They're more like snapshots of a battle, of a long war, I should say. And so I try to highlight that spiritual struggle that these characters are facing. And everybody on earth is going through that sort of spiritual struggle. And hopefully that's what viewers connect with in my movies.
En tus películas, y que en verdad son motivantes, inspiran, trabajas, como mencionas, el viaje, la carrera de la vida. En esta carrera de la vida hemos ido hacia adelante, hacia atrás, nos hemos detenido más allá de la pandemia o hemos perdido el rumbo.
That's a great question. I mean, luckily, I had the chance to spend years with a teacher, and I still consider myself at his feet, even though he's left the body. And he was very practical. So he was by no means someone who didn't understand the reality of life. But from the deepest standpoint, he would say, we all come from the same source. And that source is all light. It's all love. And that source, that divinity, is experiencing reality in and through us. We are all part of that source. When we realize that, we understand what sort of journey we're on. We're always progressing towards light. It might feel like we're going backwards. But again, the one thing that's never going backwards is the march of time. As long as time goes forwards, people are making progress. That progress might not always express itself in some sort of joy or some sort of devastation. But life is much more about that march forward where all of us have to learn not just who we are, but what our relationship with everyone is. Hundreds of years ago, you could isolate yourself in a cave or a monastery, and you could practice a contemplative life completely free from the outer world. But as things have happened the last 50, 60 years, there's no way to make spiritual progress in that old way. It's like we have to be in the world, and we have to understand and realize that the world around us is also inside of us. And that sort of realization gives us peace. And when we have that peace, we recognize that none of us have any right to the results. The joy in life comes from action. It doesn't come from the result. So if we can conduct ourselves happily, joyfully, even facing the worst situations, that's when we begin to feel the connection to something deeper, the connection to that source, which is effectively all light.
Mencionas y me genera una profunda reflexión. No podemos escondernos de la vida. Sin embargo, lo hacemos comúnmente, normalmente. No queremos ver, enfrentar cantidad de cosas. Nos gusta escondernos de muchos de esos aspectos. Hablas de aprender y en todas tus películas, además de aprender, me genera un sentido de desaprender. Mucho de lo que nos han enseñado me parece que va en otra dirección y en otro sentido de la misma naturaleza del ser humano.
That is a great way to describe it. My teacher said the same thing, that making progress is a process of both learning and unlearning. It's unlearning the parts of our personality that bind us, that keep us from making progress. It's unlearning the past. It's recognizing that once one has accepted the spiritual life, the past is dust. Essentially, it boils down to the mind and the heart. The mind is never going to give us happiness. The mind, of course, it's a good instrument for processing what's happening in the outer world, but the mind, if left alone, it wants to doubt, it wants to be suspicious. It's always dividing us. It's making us feel like what's outside of our physical body is not us. It's constantly trying to create a sense of division. But the heart, for example, the heart is what wants to connect. It wants to feel, it wants to love, it wants to have peace. Through meditation, through the spiritual life, we strengthen that heart. And most of us in Western life weren't raised with an education based on the heart. The education was always based on the mind. So we have to make the mind unlearn its importance.
Plantarnos en la tierra, sentirla, agradecerle, el alimento mismo. Te interesa mucho el alimento, el respetar a otro ser humano, el respetarnos uno mismo, el agradecer, el confrontar los aspectos verdaderamente importantes, el respirar, el enfrentar la espiritualidad y el experimentarla desde el cuerpo mismo, el cuerpo como una posibilidad de trascendencia.
On the surface, we can recognize that when we do better in anything than we've done before, we feel joy. And that joy is called self-transcendence. From a spiritual side, when we become a better person, we're able to feel more joy more regularly. That seems like the point of life to me. It might always seem that life is work when you start thinking of constantly doing better, constantly being better. It doesn't necessarily feel like there's peace in that moment, but a Hopi elder from the Hopi Nation in Arizona said to a group of us that were running uh, from central Arizona into Utah through a number of Native American reservations, he said that we must learn to find joy through exertion. More often than not, we try to choose comfort. And yeah, comfort is important from time to time to relax the mind. But we also find that we don't get any long-term joy from a life of comfort because we're not unlearning the bad side of the mind. We're not growing the qualities of the heart. The more antagonism we're experiencing in the moment, if we push through it rather than surrender, the more our capacity to experience joy grows. So, like in the idea of a race or a workout, let's just use the metaphor of a running race, which is why running is such a good spiritual metaphor. You know, there comes a point in a race where you're challenging yourself. Your mind is saying you can't do it. Your body is saying to stop. And it doesn't matter if the person is running 1 mile or 5 miles or 100 miles. We've all kind of been in those situations, even in exercise workouts. Everything in us is telling us to stop. But something inside of us is saying, no, go on, push through this, go beyond it. Try to find joy in the idea of challenging what obstacles you're facing. And we find that just by challenging those obstacles, we grow. And if we manage to conquer those obstacles, which doesn't always happen, if we manage to conquer those obstacles, we realize we come to understand a deeper side of ourselves. Everybody has had an experience where they say, gosh, I didn't succeed, but I learned more through that failure. I learned more by challenging that obstacle than almost anything else in my life.
En este sentido de éxito y fracaso, y que en tus documentales planteas a este sector recolector de frutas y verduras casi en un estado de esclavitud, o al repartidor de periódico en su carrera por la trascendencia espiritual, o el genocidio o casi genocidio de una etnia como los indios americanos. El ser humano está como triunfando o fracasando.
You know, I never frame things so harshly. That's a question that I don't think I have the ability to understand from a standpoint of success or failure. You know, 3,000 years ago, two warriors in India had a very profound conversation on the precipice of the greatest battle of their generation. The charioteer's name was Krishna. The warrior's name was Arjuna. Their conversation is known as the Bhagavad Gita, the song Celestial. In one chapter of the book, a profound chapter, Krishna basically silences Arjuna, who's asking about success and failure and cause and effect. And Krishna says, look, you have no right to the fruits of your actions. You only have the right to act. The result is never up to you. You might think it's up to you. You might think that your intention is going to lead to a result. You might think that you deserve that result. In fact, we only act because we feel like we deserve the result we're looking for. But if you act with pure intention, act in the right way, act with the sense of surrender to the divine, knowing that the divine is having an experience in and through you. And it could be an experience in the form of failure. It could be an experience in the form of success. Once you realize that you are an instrument and that's it, that's when you have peace. That's when it doesn't matter whether your daily job is picking tomatoes, whether your daily job is delivering newspapers, or whether your daily job is being the president of a country. At the same time, you're an expert at this as an artist. If you enter into a project with with mental rigidity, and that mental rigidity is your projection of the final piece. If you don't allow an experience to flow through you, you're never satisfied with the result. Or even if you are, you might not realize that the result could have been so much more satisfying if you had let go. I mean, that's the great thing for me about the filmmaking process. It's such a long creative process. These films take 2-3 years. So that idea of separating myself as a director from what I think of as success or failure allows me in the moment to see possibilities. So even just from an external point of view, I have to recognize the journey. I can't look at destinations. I can't look at momentary successes or momentary failures.
Y manteniendo esta enorme distancia entre unos recolectores de fruta en unas situaciones terribles y un director de cine o el mismo medio cinematográfico, es paralelo entre hacer una película y las compañías que la distribuyen, acaba siendo el mal ejemplo de un centavo por libra.
Yeah, I mean, there are several ways to make a film, particularly a documentary. You can work with a gigantic distributor like Netflix or Amazon from the beginning and make them a part of your process. My ideas are not mainstream enough for those companies to invest in at the very beginning. Most of my films have actually been on Netflix and Amazon Prime, but that's basically as a result of the quality of the piece. Every time I've started a project, no one, and I'm telling you, no one has believed that it would be good. And so in that sense, I have a lot of freedom as a filmmaker because I'm not making gigantic movies where a lot of people have gigantic expectations. I can make things that surprise people, and I can make things just for the sake of the art of it. Like, it's not up to me how many people watch my movies. You know, I would like millions of people to watch them right away. But at the same time, what gives me peace, I mean, this might be totally false, but what gives me peace is the idea that I'm making movies for people from the future. I can be satisfied with the idea that I've created something that has a life of its own, and that life might only start being measured in greater and greater and greater numbers 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 1,000 years from now. And that is what I feel about the running film. The farm worker film, Food Chains, it had a lot of success. This film, Gather, Jason Momoa is the executive producer. A lot of people didn't think the movie would be good. A lot of people didn't think it would get anywhere. But we're going to be on Netflix now next year. I'm not really worried about the commercial sides of things, even though I have to take that into account just to put food on the table and live a comfortable life. I try to distance myself from the commerce when it comes to making the movie.
¿Qué reflexiones hay en torno al 2020? ¿Qué sigue?
You know, I think you and I will probably have a similar perspective. We're not 21 years old anymore. We've seen a number of inflection points in history. Every time we're at an inflection point, it seems like the next step is either heaven or the apocalypse. And it's never either of them. And success and failure is not dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 months or a year of global political or economic life. At the same time, as someone from an Eastern background, I very much believe in the continuity of life and the idea of reincarnation and the fact that we're on a much longer journey than we can even comprehend. And while this year for the world has been filled with a lot of sadness, a lot of chaos, and there really isn't an immediate end in sight, I think at the same time, going back to what we spoke of earlier, this year, those of us who are still on Earth had no other choice but to exert ourselves. We all worked harder emotionally, spiritually, physically in this year as a species than we have in our lifetimes. I think we need to allow ourselves some time to reflect on all the positive things that have happened despite all of the suffering we might have faced personally. We all definitely know how precious life is. We know how precious our friends are. In the absence of community, we understand even more how precious community is, our cities are, our families are, and hopefully this wisdom stays with us so that we can actually build something when we get the chance to do so again. So I really appreciate this conversation. It's great spending time with you. Last year in 2019, everything was physical. Now everything is on Zoom, but it's still just as meaningful. So thank you.